Morning glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. Great to have you all with me. Evening grace to those of you listening in the evening. I always love it when a Democrat shows up. The list of Democrats who like to come by is relatively short. Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, Ro Khanna from California. Angus King is Democrat adjacent. My senator from Maine, Chris Coons from Delaware. And my guest, Chris Murphy, senator from Connecticut, joins me, a member of the House for 6 years, a member of the Senate for 12. Senator, welcome back. Good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me. I want you to get a couple of swings in first. What'd you make of the House budget that passed last night?
Yeah, I think it'll represent the most massive transfer of wealth and resources from the middle class and the poor to the wealthy, perhaps in the history of the country. 8 years ago when they did the big tax cut, for most of that money went to the very wealthy and the corporations. It was all borrowed, right? So we just racked up in the end at least $2 trillion on our credit card. The economy didn't grow like they promised, and so it just got added onto the national debt. This time around, the debt will grow because $3 trillion of this is going to be borrowed, but over $1 trillion will come from cuts to programs that do matter to regular people. 24% of Americans are insured by Medicaid, working Americans, kids. That's how we pay for 2/3 of the nursing home beds in this country. And they're going to do $880 billion, somewhere around that, of cuts to Medicaid. There's no way for that to happen without a lot of people losing their insurance in a lot of red states, hospitals closing, addiction treatment centers closing. And I just don't know why that's worth it if the bulk of the savings is going to go to people who are already very, very wealthy. I know they're going to have some tax cuts in here that will, help middle class folks, but the lion's share of the benefit will go to the very, very wealthy, financed by Medicaid cuts, which I just think is like not what people thought was going to happen when they elected Donald Trump. I don't remember him promising to gut the Medicaid program, and I think people are going to be, in for a pretty rude awakening when their rural hospital closes and they didn't get a tax cut that was anywhere close to the size of the tax cut that the CEOs got.
So, Senator, the American Rescue Plan of 2021, which passed via reconciliation, ran a deficit of $1.9 trillion. The second big Biden swing, the Inflation Reduction Act, cost $1 trillion over 10 years, $2 to $4 trillion over 25 years. So it looks to me like the House budget, I'm not sure it's the final, but the House budget actually uses deficit spending less than the two budgets that the Democrats passed when they had the reconciliation process. Why is that not apples to apples?
Well, for a very important reason. You're conflating two bills that are not similar. So the Inflation Reduction Act was fully paid for. It, in fact, reduced the deficit. You are right that the stimulus bill, the first bill, that was passed on the heels of other deficit-funded COVID relief bills, was deficit financed, just like all the COVID relief bills that Donald Trump passed were deficit financed. But after that first COVID relief bill that Biden passed, that next big swing, the Inflation Reduction Act, included, whether people like it or not, offsets, reductions in spending under Medicare, increases in personal and corporate tax liability that more than offset the payments. So, yeah, it's just not apples to apples because the Inflation Reduction Act was offset, was paid for, and actually reduced the deficit.
Okay, it's an interview, not a debate, but I'll send the audience. They can go look up the Inflation Reduction cost, the Inflation Reduction Act cost. Couple of questions. Do you want to tax?
But you're right about the cost. I mean, the cost is high. The cost is high, but there's two. Those are two different conversations. The cost is big. The question is what the impact on the deficit is, and the cost can be big, but as long as you have offsets, meaning either corresponding spending cuts or tax increases, the impact on the deficit is different than the overall.
And my research, and I can be wrong, frequently wrong, never in doubt on the radio and the television. My research said that the Inflation Reduction Act resulted in a deficit of $1 trillion over 10 years and $2 to $4 trillion over 25. But let's leave it to the audience to find out. I want to ask you, do you want to tax overtime, Senator?
Oh, listen, I'm willing to do anything that is, good for working people out there, whether it's reducing tax liability for overtime or their underlying wages. Ultimately, though, if you're working overtime and you pay a little bit less in taxes, but you lose your health insurance, that's not a good trade. And that's the trade that the Republicans are asking for. In many of these red states, they have Medicaid expansion programs that disappear, literally just disappear the minute that the match falls below 90%. There's no way to get $880 billion of Medicaid cuts without that match falling below 90%. So, ultimately, every family has a budget. And if they pay a little bit less in taxes on a handful of overtime hours, but they lose their health care, that's not a trade that they want.
Okay, the House budget also would eliminate the tax on tips. Do you want to tax tips?
That's a little bit more complicated question, right? There are a lot of people in this country that make their wages based on tips. And the question is, do you want an economy in which, folks don't pay taxes on tips, but pay taxes on salary or hourly income? Does that mean that ultimately a lot of work sort of gets shifted away from regular wages and into tips? I'm up for the conversation on how to do it, but I don't think that that's an easy one. There are going to be a lot of people in my state who will say, well, wait a second, I don't make my money on tips. I just go to work every day and, get paid $15 an hour. I got to pay, full taxes on that, but somebody that makes the majority of their wages in tips pays less taxes. That doesn't sound fair to me. So I'm up for the conversation. That one is just a lot more complicated when it comes to creating a fair tax structure.
But the House budget does both eliminate taxes on tips and taxes on overtime. You don't like the budget. I wonder if you want to keep those provisions or jettison them.
Well, just to be clear, it doesn't do either of those things. I mean, there's this claim that the House budget reduces or eliminates taxes on overtime and taxes on tips. It absolutely doesn't. Like, there's nothing in that budget document that they passed last night that says anything about eliminating taxes on overtime or taxes on tips. So, they may want to do that in the future, but that's actually nowhere in the budget they passed last night.
That goes to the Ways and Means Committee. I know how reconciliation works. I'm just assuming you do as well. That will be part of the Ways and Means reconciliation of the budget with their oversight committee. But if in fact they eliminate taxes on tips and overtime, are you going to vote up or down on that?
But how do you know? I mean,
because it's been
asking
promised.
me how I'm going to vote. You're saying how I'm going to vote. Well, no. If that bill is paid for by removing health insurance from millions of Americans, that's a terrible deal for Americans. I'm just telling you, there's no appetite in this country to have taxes on overtime pay reduced in exchange for your health care being taken away, your rural hospital being closed, and your mom being kicked out of the nursing home. Like, that's not a good deal for people. So if that's how that bill is structured, and it also raises the deficit, something that I thought Republicans cared about, by $3 trillion that's put on the American family's credit card, that doesn't sound like a good trade.
I want to assure my right-wing listeners, it's an interview, not a debate. If I were debating the senator, I would debate that.
I get spirited about this, Hugh. I get animated about it.
I know, but I just want people to know I'm not pushing back because it's an interview. Senator, this is a quasi-ambush question, but it's with a purpose. Do you know where the Office of Personnel Management is?
Where, the address of it?
Yeah.
No, I don't know the individual addresses.
Have you been inside of it?
I don't think it's an ambush question. I'm not sure that people expect that we know the addresses of these.
Have you been inside of OPM?
Of OPM? No, I do my business on the phone.
Okay. The reason I ask is because
generally when administration officials meet with members of Congress, they come to see us.
I think maybe you ought to go down to OPM. I ran it for 2.5 years as the general counsel, as the deputy director, and as the acting director. I know OPM. I think what DOGE is doing is great. I think the email from OPM was fine. I have no problem just skinnying down the government by at least 25%. What do you think?
I don't think that's what's going on. I mean, ultimately, I think that this is a thoughtless meat cleaver that is ultimately going to compromise the security of this country. I mean, you and I can have a conversation about soft power and USAID, but I think what they're doing at state and what they're doing at USAID is going to make this country less safe. Unilaterally deciding to fire everybody that has been onboarded in the last year or so has nothing to do with efficiency. That's just getting rid of everybody that showed up recently. Those hires in some of these departments might be the most critical hires. The folks that have been onboarded in the last few months at the FAA might be the most important people at the FAA. Or
They've only fired
Department of State.
143 people at the FAA. It's got 45,000 people.
It doesn't, whatever's happening at the FAA doesn't seem to be working right now, because the planes are at risk of falling out of the sky.
No, actually, I am going to debate you there. 143 probationary employees out of 45,000 were laid off. None of them had anything to do with critical path safety. Senator, you're welcome to say, but I know you got to roll.